Good.
So welcome everybody. So Catherine and I met with Pat with CBI earlier this week and worked through some of the support that they can provide us. And I am very excited that he's here. He's going to walk us through a conversation later on in the meeting after we get through the couple of business items. I think that definitely will help us keep the conversation going along in the meeting too. Just a couple of business items. We have a review and approval of the agenda as well as the 4.2 and 4.9 minutes. It appears that we don't have to have any sort of motion or anything to approve the minutes or anything like that. So that's a good thing. But they are linked on the agenda, which is linked on the Climate Council Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee website. So that is on there, but just wanted to go through the agenda real quick. At Pat's suggestion, after this, we're going to go through a couple of introductions just so that we can get to know each other a little bit better and allow a couple of folks to two members and one staff support member introduce themselves and a little bit more about their background and for 2 minutes each. And then we'll work into Climate Council Steering Committee update from Jane, a quick work plan update from Pat and from myself and Catherine. And then we wanted to have a discussion, kind of stop and take a step back and have a discussion around really why we're here. And while we have the subject matter experts in the room, just really have a high level discussion about Vermont's climate change threats. What are they? And what are the rural Vermont challenges and barriers, the barriers in rural Vermont as it relates to addressing climate change threats. We haven't had a chance to just really have a round robin discussion about that. And we really felt now that we've kind of finalized work plan, we would take a step back and really, take a review on that, and so that we can, come to consensus about what our direction really is from here. And then we would also round out the meeting, planning the future subcommittee agendas, especially since we're finished the work plan, really look at how we want to frame meetings from here on out. Catherine, how would you like to add any notes or comments or updates this morning?
No, and the agenda looks good to me. I'm curious if any subcommittee members have any changes to the agenda or any items in the minutes that they want to make corrections. Joe, you're muted.
Thanks. I have a question. I'm sorry, but I missed. So were the minutes sent out previously, or should we just know to go to the website for them?
Yeah, they'll always be posted on the website. So that's the best and most efficient way to get a hold of those on a weekly basis.
Okay.
Also, Joe, when Erica and Catherine send out the agenda, Melissa is so kind that she links it in the agenda. So you'll know if you get the agenda a couple days beforehand, you can just click right there to see the minutes that way. It's super easy.
Okay.
So if there are no corrections to the minutes or adjustments to the agenda, we can go ahead and move on to introductions. And because we don't do a formal motion to approve the minutes, if you should find later when you go back that there's an error or something that needs to be corrected, just let us know and we can work on that. So is there anybody that'd like to volunteer on the subcommittee to do a little bit more of an extended introduction to help us get to know each other a little bit more?
This is Karen. I could introduce myself, Catherine, because also I missed the first couple of meetings, for which I apologize. But I work with the Vermont League of Cities and Towns. I've been doing that for 33 years, which puts me way back in the last century. And I follow advocacy issues, any bill that comes up in the legislature that affects local governments. We also do a lot of work with agencies when they're putting together rules and guidance and handbooks, and Joe Segali's long-range transportation plan, which we love, and those kinds of documents. And we are hoping actually that we'll have some funding to put together a new program at the League that will help towns navigate the Arpa dollars and how to spend them in compliance with that law. Beyond just myself, for those who might not be familiar, we are a membership association of all the cities and towns in the state, and we provide technical assistance, training. We have lawyers on staff who will answer questions for local officials. And we also provide insurance, workers' comp, liability, and unemployment insurance to local officials. And I think that's pretty much it. I'm happy to answer questions or whatever.
Thanks very much, Karen. That was really great. Any questions for Karen? And do I have another volunteer? Oh, Anne, go for it.
Thanks, Catherine. I'm Ann Lawless. I live in the town of Wheelock in Caledonia County, and I retired a couple years ago after a career in museums. And I touched on disaster issues there because the American Precision Museum is in Windsor, and we did have some Irene damage. And thank goodness for Ben Rose. And let's see. So after I retired, I decided I needed to spend more time in my community because I had been sort of commuting. It's a 90-mile run. So I found myself elected to the select board in Wheelock. And I've been doing that for 2 years, and it is very interesting and very challenging. And we couldn't do it without VLCT for sure. We're active members, constantly getting, utilizing, taking advantage of the wonderful support that VLCT provides. I also serve on the board of the Vermont Historical Records Advisory. That's with through the State Archives Office. Done that for quite a number of years. I'm a new member of the board of the Old Stone House Museum in Brownington. I'm the chair of the Collections Committee, and I'm a master gardener. And when I'm not doing any of that stuff, my real job is I work part-time with Heat Squad. We do home energy audits, and I'm the Northeast Kingdom Outreach Coordinator. And Heat Squad is a program that's been running for 10 years. It's based at NeighborWorks of Western Vermont in West Rutland. And it's great to be with this group. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne. I love these introductions. It helps us learn things like, who do we call when I have this noxious weed in my garden when I can't figure out how to get rid of?
I was going to say, we are going to talk, Anne.
Maybe we need to add a standing agenda item, questions for Anne. Great. Thanks so much, Anne. Is there someone who is acting as our staff support that would like to volunteer to go first in the introductions this week?
Rob Evans has his hand up.
Oh, great. Thanks, Rob.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
I consider myself secondary staff support. I was initially nominated to provide support. You know, I'm extremely busy, so I will be ducking in and out as my schedule allows, but I'm particularly interested in the work of the subcommittee. I'm the DEC Rivers Program Manager within ANR. We do a lot of work, regulatory work around work in rivers and streams and floodplains. We do a lot of water quality related work related to floodplain restoration and conservation, and provide broad-based technical assistance to citizens, municipalities, RPCs, you name it. I have two daughters that are in high school that keep us very busy. When I'm not busy trying to keep tabs on their lives, I enjoy mountain biking and skiing. And I've been trying to keep up with the work of the subcommittee by watching after the fact, you know, the video recordings of your meetings, keeping an eye on agendas. So I've been plugged in, just a degree removed. So glad to finally join you in person. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Rob. And as Pat noted in the chat, we'll be taking turns and making sure we get to everybody over the course of a few meetings. So this has been a great start. Thank you all so much for everyone who volunteered to go first. So next on our agenda, we have the Vermont Climate Council Steering Committee update, and that would be turning it over to you, Jane.
Good afternoon, everybody. Fun to see the Zoom in action. So one of my first brief updates is that
Jane, your audio is challenged.
oh my gosh. Let's see.
Jane, if you talk closely into the, maybe calling in would be better. Yeah, sorry. We were working with Jane to fix this. There's a Teams Zoom switching back and forth that somehow throws off audio sometimes, so we apologize.
Do we want to go to the work plan update first and then come back to Jane's update?
Let's do that.
Okay. So work plan. One of the reasons we met with Pat earlier this week was he did some work transferring the work plan to a chart. And I don't know if Pat, do you want me to hand this over to you now so you can kind of explain that, like walk us through that?
Sure, I can do that. And then do you want to, I think, Catherine, if you can pull it up, because I think I have just the slightly older version. If Catherine, you were able to pull that up.
I've got it right here if you want me to. There you go.
There we go. Okay, good. So this may be a little hard for folks to see on their screen, but let me we'll kind of walk through just the general idea. So this is all from the earlier work plan that you saw, and there were good edits at the last meeting. So what we did was really just transfer this. We wanted to be clear about what the outcomes were and not have them kind of lost in all the text. So those are up front as the outcomes you all are trying to produce. So that was why those put up front. And then we just really took the kind of objectives and strategies and some of the detail and transferred it into kind of a timeline. So we put a priority title under a number of things, just in some ways in sequence more than importance. We left the objective and the strategy. Sometimes we had to shorten the language to make it fit into the matrix. We were trying to be clear about who are the lead members, who are supporting members, if you need outside support, if you need stakeholder engagement in particular. And we let that be kind of a cross-cutting issue. So we put that at the top. And then roughly, so we kind of know where you're at in your schedule, kind of a start and end date for that activity. And again, this is all probably subject to some further good deliberation and the like. So in this way, hopefully people can kind of see how things fit together, both in terms of time and people and resources, and making sure we're capturing all the different issues. And under the engagement needed, hopefully identify those steps or activities in particular that probably or maybe are going to likely require engagement beyond just the subcommittee. So Eric and Catherine, that's the general gist. I don't know whether we want to go through this in detail or have people, give you a red line strikeout to a version that we can send out. I don't know what your thoughts are there.
So our original plan was to send this back out to subcommittee members so they could have one more chance to add their names under support members for some of the tasks, as well as make minor edits. And I don't think we added it to the calendar appointment, but we didn't really communicate to subcommittee members that this is the final version. Take a look at any final comments you have for it, and then we'll just finalize it. Catherine, do you feel like we should do that, after this meeting, and just give folks a chance to reply to one of us and integrate the final comments?
Yes, I think that makes sense. If people could, we'll send it back out to everybody one more time. And then if you could get any final comments back to me, within the week, then we'll have it available for our next discussion. But we imagine this will be somewhat of a living document, evolving as we go. So we don't need to make it perfect. We just need to get it to the point where we feel like it's a reflective enough of a guide of our work to give us the direction we need.
And then folks will be able to always access the most recent version of the work plan on the subcommittee page of the Vermont Climate Council website. So you'll always, that's where it will live.
And if you haven't seen it yet, there's a section for documents under the subcommittee, and that's where things like this will live.
So questions from members about any of this overall, or any specifics you want to take a quick look at it? And again, I think you all know this in Zoom, you can raise your hand, and that's either in the participant list if it's an older version of Zoom, and if it's a newer version, under reactions at the bottom of the kind of the scroll bar or the control bar is under reactions, there's a hand raise function there as well. Or you can just try to wave and we might be able to see you depending on how things are going. I would note that from last time's conversation that we added there was some language we added in the longer document, and then the sort of shortened version in matrix in terms of equity and some things were raised last time. So some of those things were added. All right, co-chairs, looks like not any questions this time, but I'm sure people will look at it in detail and give great comments.
Awesome. Oh, Joe,
Jane.
you so didn't want to cut you off. We're good. Okay.
Yeah.
Now we can. You would think that I'd be used to, virtual meetings by now, but it's still very clunky. Let's go over to Jane for steering committee update.
Okay, does this sound better? Zoom is very frustrating that I cannot get my fingers to work. And of course, when I actually troubleshot it with the CBI staff, they worked perfectly. So thank you all for your patience as I switched over. And briefly, I'll give you an update on the steering committee meeting and how it pertains to the full council meeting on the 26th, and ultimately some in-between work I could see happening and residing within your subcommittee in particular. So the steering committee meeting was yesterday. It focused primarily on the agenda development for the council meeting on the 26th and some substantive topics within that agenda. The steering committee had some thoughtful conversation around. The first main point of discussion that will impact all of the work of the subcommittees is largely related around the drafting of the climate action plan and putting forward an outline for what that plan will look like. I did that in concert with David Plum, our facilitator at the last steering committee member meeting, I should say, and got some really great feedback, made revisions and edits based on that, and again, tested the outline at yesterday's meeting. What I'll say is that as I've been thinking about the structure and how the climate action plan will take shape, it's clear to me how to deal with the mitigation components of the plan. There's a clear statutory requirement that this is our one and only plan before we reach the 2025 statutory requirement of emissions reduction. But yet it's not as clear as sort of the breadth and scope for the sequestration and resiliency components of this first plan, it's a little more open-ended, which is where I feel like there's room for some conversation. In particular, the way that the sequestration, or I should say Ag and Ecosystems Group, aligned their task lead work, they sort of set out that work topically based on what felt like broad brush strategies. Your work, when I dove into it, wasn't as clear for me yet about what those big strategies would be. And so I want to suggest that even ahead of the full council taking it up, that I would love the space next week to share the outline with you all, make some improvements to the way I drafted the outline for the resiliency section of the plan, and just like test that with all of you. I have some thoughts about how I can make it better based on yesterday's conversation, and would love the space to have that conversation with you all before it goes in front of the full council the following Monday. So that's one of the sort of big topics for the Climate Council meeting, sort of putting forward what we can and can't do for December 1st deadline, and having a conversation about the structure of that outline, and hopefully coming to consensus on what that looks like, so that I can then move into developing some templates and supporting documents for you all to feed your work into, so you have a framework to be building around. So that's one. The other thing that was discussed in sort of substantive form yesterday ahead of the meeting was that we'll use that conversation to springboard into a larger conversation about public engagement. And our new contractor is on board, Climate Access. They met with the Just Transitions Committee last night to start and kick off the conversation, where they presented their proposal that they put forward for the RFP in thinking about engagement specifically, and had a great back and forth. And the Just Transitions Committee, in partnership with Climate Access, will present that proposal and tee up a nice conversation that David will facilitate around sort of the iterative nature of public engagement, and how the other subcommittees feed into that process, how they feed into the development of public engagement, and how that public engagement comes back to the other subcommittees to inform your work, and how we do that back and forth. So that'll be the next conversation. And then really putting a pin in what we can and can't do for December 1st around public engagement, and how we set the stage to do more of it beyond December 1st. And then finally, suggesting, just recognizing there'll be some small agenda items, but also the final big component of the agenda will be around the role of the Climate Council itself in these next few months, where most of the meat and work is happening at the subcommittees, and how we facilitate that cross-pollination from the one subcommittee to other subcommittees. And in the process roadmap that was approved, it's called for the role of the steering committee to facilitate the coming together of co-chairs on a timely manner, in order to sort of sort through sticky issues, or sort through who's on first for what, and how to coordinate that work. So we'll be talking about the role of how often the council meets, and also how the steering committee moves to support that work with cross-pollination with the subcommittees. So that was the main topics that the steering committee took up. We also spoke a bit about recent legislative testimony. I expect we'll rehash that again at the Climate Council meeting, as well as Arpa funding, which I think many of you are intricately involved in. Julie, Secretary Moore, I should say, with the help of other secretaries, plans to tee up the ARPA funding proposal by the governor for the full council, and also allow the space of the other secretaries and directors influenced by that money to also speak to how they see it taking shape and form, recognizing that there's a proposal to sort of move some money forward right now with big ticket items that we know are the no regrets things that we need to do for climate work. And then there's also a proposal to hold $100 million for implementation of the Climate Action Plan, and what that means for the council and all of your work going forward. It's really quite exciting and unbelievable. So I'll pause there, and that's really all I have for the steering committee update, but I'd love to just circle back to the outline or any other questions you have and see if there'd be space to talk a little bit about that next week here at your meeting.
I for one would very much love to see the outline of the climate plan, because I think it's good timing since we just finished the work plan and we're about to launch into the completion of those tasks. And so it would be great to know what we're working toward, especially as it pertains to drafting recommendations and as it pertains to how we're doing assessing the programs.
Great.
Could I just add a quasi-random comment, which is that in our newsletter this morning, we were asked by the Legislative Climate Caucus to put in a questionnaire about ARPA-related climate projects that towns and schools would be interested in, and also how the legislative priorities around ARPA funding could support those projects. And I'm wondering if there's some way that we might actually meld the responses that we get from communities, or that the Climate Caucus gets from communities, into this document. If not in terms of actual action plans right now, but just so we have kind of a list of what local governments are thinking about.
That's really great, and I'm sure it's a little different, but somewhat similar. I'm sure you know Chris Campany, or he serves on the Climate Council. He's been really sort of hitting home, and we have a meeting next week to sort of consider how regional energy plans and town plans can help inform the climate action plan, and sort of building local up into the larger state plan. And so I do feel like any kind of survey that the Vermont League of Cities and Towns puts out almost serves as like some really interesting, clear public engagement around the work that we're all doing. And I think it would be really wonderful to think about how we feed into that. And maybe there's a role or a conversation with you, Karen, with our new contract consultant, Climate Access, to think about how that could feed into the engagement and outreach they want to do with communities also.
Okay, that sounds good. And just to be clear, this one is not our survey, it's the Climate Caucus survey. We're just being, conveying the information, but yeah, that would be good. Thank you.
And Karen, I'm really glad you brought that up, because when I saw that Climate Caucus put that out, my first thought was, oh, this could feed into our best practices conversation, because we'll see from a municipal perspective, if you had money, what would you do? And so that is a great way of asking a question where people get creative, rather than just a general, what would you do? If you have money, what would you do? Definitely gets the creativity up a little more.
Well, hearing no other questions or feedback, I'm happy that, Erica, you support that, and it sounds like others will likely support that too. And I can think about how I bring it forward, but having a few minutes to think about the outline and the role of the resiliency work in the climate action plan would be really great next week.
Thanks, Jane.
Yeah.
So next on our agenda is a conversation about climate change threats and risks in rural Vermont, and our barriers that our communities and individuals will face. And we're going to turn it over to Pat, who's going to introduce and facilitate this part of our agenda.
So, hey, all subcommittee members, this is a chance to kind of just jump in together. And I think the co-chairs for just this conversation are going to step into just, a member like all of you, and we'll weigh in with their views too. So I'm going to share my screen. I tried a bit of a framework just for conversation. One of your early objectives is to kind of begin to detail this out and then actually rank what are more important for rural communities. So this is just the beginning. My framework may not be quite right, so we can fix that in real time here, but it's a way to kind of get the conversation going and help feed into kind of the substance that you all are going to really try to dive into. And we know members are anxious to get to work and a little tired of process. So this is hopefully a chance to get into some of the substance. So with that, The co-chairs don't own any of this. This is strictly mine. So all faults and responsibilities are solely mine, just to say. So let me kind of explain what this thing is. Let me just get my, make sure I can see all of you on my second screen still. Okay. So what I thought we could do is these are just examples. This is really for you to just brainstorm and add, and I will subtract, add, and kind of just take notes as we go. But the thought is to try to identify what you think are the hazards of threats from climate change, particularly for rural communities. I've guessed at some, they may not be right. What some of those impacts might be. So if the threat's flooding, right, an impact might be a structure's destroyed or damaged, right? And then to the right of that are what are the barriers or challenges to those addressing or being resilient to those various impacts. And just as an example, there's some things you don't have control over, like FEMA programs sometimes are actual barriers. You don't have enough money to necessarily in a local budget to clear a road, for instance, right? If it floods too much and it's filled with wood or debris or whatever. So we thought we'd just kind of, one is see if you all want to name the number of hazards and threats you see to rural communities kind of on that left-hand column and get that right. And from all of you from brainstorming, and then we can just start working through some of these. We probably won't get done today, but at least it's a start. So one, how does that look as a way to structure the conversation today? Is that okay? Okay. So why don't we start on that left-hand column, which hazard or threats. I've named a few, but please jump in for other ones you would want to name, or if you think my hazard is too general and we need to break it down into parts, and ignore my dog barking if you can. So Mike, I know you had your mic open. Did you want to comment?
The first thing that came to mind on the top one was in the barriers to resilience. And I do think that sometimes permitting and property rights become a pretty big issue. Maybe that can even go to the top of that, speaking from experience.
Can you say a little bit more about property rights, what you mean by that in terms of a barrier?
Specifically for what I do and where I'm trying to help towns and communities increase electric reliability. If you have to have easements onto somebody's property, things, so easements, and that I know that happens with road projects as well. So just that's why I say property rights, because it's not just an electricity thing, but it's culvert replacement, everything. Some things that help, sometimes you just can't get the rights to do them.
Yeah, right. Anne.
I would, maybe this fits under FEMA program constraints, but I don't think so, because FEMA program constraints come from FEMA. So there are towns that do not belong to the National Flood Insurance Program and towns that do not have zoning. So those towns are they're more vulnerable because they have fewer tools and fewer resources, and they have a lack of understanding about what the kinds of good that those regulations can do.
Great. Rob, over to you.
Yeah, I'd just like to add to that, and kind of going back to the property rights piece, and Erica and her team and Catherine and others on this meeting are keenly aware of this, but there's the property rights as it relates to land use regulations is really a big one. We try to encourage towns to adopt more stringent floodplain management and river corridor regulations. Yep. To try to keep risky investments out of particular hazardous areas. And while we've tried to create incentives for that, and there's been uptake with a number of towns in the state, the property rights piece is very real. I mean, some towns will never really have the political will, just given the resistance to layering on additional land use regulation.
Not sure if I framed it quite right, but I put it resistance to regulatory intrusion on land use regulations or something like that.
Perfect. Much more succinct than my rambling.
No, I'm listening for your good stuff. No worries.
So I want to, I can't find the place to raise my hand on Zoom, but I just want to note that, and I put this in chat, in the act, there's a list of threats that we're supposed to be considering in this. And you have some of them here, but there's some that are missing. Like I may get this wrong, but that's why I put it in chat. You can kind of like true those two things up eventually, but things like vector-borne diseases or cyanobacteria blooms, the phosphorus stuff, forest and ag soils, forest and crop damage, irregular sugaring seasons, less uncertain snowfall. So sorry, I'm going kind of fast, but it's in the chat. But those are all the things that I think we absolutely have to have those on this list. What they say we need to be looking at in the act.
And that's good, Joe. And I did not look carefully at the act to pull those out. So I think we can add those. That's really good to do. I didn't get them all that you said, but I think that makes good sense to add.
Yeah.
And I wonder, like on something like cyanobacteria, I wonder if, that's a combination of potentially nutrient loading and temperature. So whether that is actually, the hazard or threat, or it's actually an impact of climate change. And I don't, sometimes it's hard to separate the two out. So.
Yeah. And that's just what's listed in the act. And I guess I hadn't thought about that connection. Climate change isn't the initial cause of that problem. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons for it happening, which lots of folks on this call are aware of, but I think it probably is making it a little bit worse. It's sort of a, secondary impact, I guess. Even like flooding has an impact on phosphorus going into the lake, because there's more erosion on riverbanks, and that ends up, putting more phosphorus into the water. So it's interesting to think about these in that fashion as well.
That's great. And Marion. And
Thanks,
I think
Pat.
also, just be clear, I think, are we calling only on subcommittee members, co-chairs? How do we handle that? I just wanted to be clear. And staff, how do you want to do it?
I think we can just have an open conversation of anyone who wants to participate and offer thoughts.
Okay, great. Marion, over to you.
Thanks, Catherine. So I wanted to bring something up that isn't quite a hazard, but it is something we talked about at a previous meeting, and that is the sort of impact of climate migration. And I did want to bring this up as Kate McCarthy is not able to join as a member, but I know this was a topic she was interested in talking about. So I sort of, my question to pose to the group is, where do we consider impacts such as climate migration or other things that we don't want to consider hazard, but will certainly have an impact on our Vermont communities? I was taking a look at the Global Warming Solutions Act, and it does identify that the Climate Action Plan should include specific initiatives and programs around smart growth and related strategies. And I'm just wondering, is it the responsibility of this subcommittee to consider those strategies around sort of the impact on migration to Vermont communities? Whereas it's not, we don't want to call that a hazard, but it will certainly have an impact on our populations.
Well, Marion, for now, I just put under as an impact. I'm not sure what the hazard is, but I'll make sure we have it there for sure. Right.
Yeah, that may be a question maybe for Jane and the steering committee. If there's if there's anything specifically that the steering committee wants from the subcommittees related to the impact of climate migration, and how they would like the subcommittees to address that, since it is called out in the Global Warming Solutions Act, but it's not really, doesn't really specifically call out who needs to address it.
I do think that it's both a threat and an opportunity, and I feel like it is something that we should be thinking about in the resilience subcommittee and adaptation subcommittee. And just it seems kind of logical that we should be thinking about that and what the strategies are to mitigate whatever negative impacts might result, and take advantage of any opportunities it creates. And so anyway, that's just my opinion on it, because I think that's, even though I feel like it's a long-term, long-term is sort of incremental. Like, I don't think we're going to get a tsunami of people moving to Vermont because of climate change, because it's going to be happening kind of slowly. But I think it's logical that we think about it. And I see its impacts in other areas, like in just, more people means more greenhouse gas emissions too, from everything that we do.
Right. Good point. Good thing. Well, for now, I'm going to leave it under, if it's big enough, I'm going to put under impact, though that's maybe not quite right. And then we can obviously tease it out as we go further.
Yeah.
So again, I think, are there, and I, certainly Joe mentioned some things we need to add from the legislation. Are there other kind of threats or risks you want to name explicitly that you care about, that you're worried about? We want to make sure we begin to build from here. Catherine.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure where it fits on the table, but it seems to me that the lack of capital, both human and financial, is a risk for our rural communities, or maybe it's a barrier, or maybe it's both. But that to me is something that we need to be thinking about.
There may be some ones that end up emerging as kind of cross-cutting. So I'll put it as a cross-cutting one for now. Graham. And Graham, you're on mute, so. Graham, I know you're there. It's the ghost hand. All right. Oh, there you go. Graham, go ahead.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir. Can hear you now.
Oh, great. This is Graham. I'm the policy director at Rural Vermont. And part of what I'm wondering here is it seems like all of these impacts and hazards are really related to ecosystem disruption and weather events and, species migration related to climate change. And I'm wondering if this group sees itself as having roles. When I think about rural community resilience and adaptation, the human communities and their socioeconomic well-being come also to me in terms of thinking here. And, we know right now, for example, I'm just wondering how this group is thinking about like approaching, the current existing socioeconomic challenges in rural communities and how they may be exacerbated by climate change, whether that's access to medical care, different medical conditions, poverty, lack of economic opportunity, marginalization of working lands communities. The topic that was just brought up about increasing land values and prices and displacement of people, climate migration, sort of food and resource sovereignty and consolidation of land ownership over time, access to land for Black, Indigenous, POC, and poor community members, people who have historically been discriminated against or underrepresented, things like this. And I think, I just came from the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee meeting, and I would just suggest that you all consider a strong connection to that committee and perhaps consistent liaisons from both groups to one another, because I feel like your missions are very related and overlapping and, necessarily so.
Graham, a quick question just to make sure I get. So you mentioned, you fired off a few things I just want to make sure I get. So you mentioned lack of medical care and access, and there were some other things you said. Could you just say those one more time?
Sure. And these were just some things that came to my mind at the time, that are currently issues in rural communities, whether it's access to medical care. We're seeing different medical conditions arise. This year, as someone who's out a lot, there's a lot more ticks, and I'm sure we're going to see a lot more tick-borne diseases and others growing. Someone talked about climate migration and impacts on probably land prices and land access, but I think there's also other issues that are related to food and resource sovereignty and consolidation of land ownership more broadly, issues like that.
Okay, got you. Thank you.
Economic opportunity, transportation.
Great, terrific. And I don't know if people have thoughts about how this committee is thinking about some of these socioeconomic, I called them historic inequities exacerbated. I'm not sure if that's the right terminology, but winging a guess here. Erica.
Yeah, I think it definitely works into the recommendations that we need to develop, and it works into the assessments that we are doing. For this exercise, this exercise is really meant to center on what this group feels are, the hazards and threats that we need to look at by statute, and then, what are the impacts of those? And I would also be interested in hearing, when we look at them in terms of priority, what this group feels based on your own subject matter expertise is some of the greatest climate change related threats to Vermont, because I think that's important as we prioritize our recommendations. And then I have an addition here in terms of barriers. There are certain barriers that are built in to programs that are meant to make communities more resilient. And one of them, I've mentioned this with Pat and Catherine, but one of them is the hazard mitigation program has institutional barriers to entry that can exacerbate especially the financial related inequities of communities. And so those are things that, if your home is that you're looking for a buyout is in an area where property values are not very high, then your cost benefit analysis for that property is not going to be as strong, and therefore your project is not going to rate very highly. Whereas projects in higher value areas and that could see higher amounts of damage are more likely to rate stronger. And so that is an institutional inequity that's in the system, and there are many others. I mean, there's the hazard mitigation program, as well as many other disaster recovery programs can be, and preparedness programs can be pretty heavy on the front end in terms of the regulations that folks have to meet. And it's something that folks have at the national level have been talking a lot about and trying to address, especially with FEMA. And my folks from VEM just raised their hand, so I'm going to be quiet because maybe I said something wrong.
I would go to Stephanie and then to Ben. So Stephanie.
No, you didn't say anything wrong. And I think Ben had his hand up first, but he dropped it. So he might add things after I'm done. But yeah, I completely agree with everything you just said. I think part of the inequity is that in order to do a buyout, your town has to be willing to support the project. So we had communities following Irene where the town was unwilling to do buyouts, so the homeowners didn't have access. So that's a piece of it. And a lot of it has to do with whether the town actually has the capability to manage the funding or not, which is definitely a challenge. So whether they can work with me and get the application in, but then also have the ability to manage the funding appropriately is huge. And then on the FEMA program constraints, the second one from the top there, I think there's a couple of things that fall under that. So one I think is the mapping in the state. So our special flood hazard area mapping, they're doing a lot of updates in the state right now, but our mapping is very old, and that impacts whether communities can access projects or not, whether they're in the special flood hazard area. So old mapping is a piece of it, and then just the hazard mitigation assistance program constraints broadly. So projects needing to be in the special flood hazard area, needing to be under a certain threshold in order to do buyouts. And we can't purchase vacant land. There's a lot of things. I won't dig into all of it, but I think that captures the big ones. Did I miss anything, Ben, that you were thinking about?
No, I mean, I agree with everything you both just said, and I'll just add a few more points piling on this. I put a link to the executive summary of the state hazard mitigation plan in the chat. It both lists hazards very, very well, and it identifies a big, hard to-do item, which is to create a state hazard mitigation program, which would supplement, buttress, and provide cost share for FEMA's rule-bound program. And that is an opportunity we have now with the ARP money. I said on the Wednesday night equity call last week that the current structure of the federal hazard mitigation program is sort of a big cross subsidy from the communities that have from the communities that don't have resources to the communities that do have resources. Because as Ann knows, the really small all volunteer communities struggle to get hazard mitigation plans done, and the select boards don't have a dime they don't feel like they have a source of non-federal local match to do projects, even if they're a cost-effective investment of federal dollars. So the select boards that don't want to come up with local match make it impossible for their flood-prone neighbors to participate in the buyout program. And a state program could have rules that would be much more helpful to rural economically constrained places in Vermont.
Thanks, Ben. Additional thoughts on some of these regulatory barriers or lack of state programs or other hazards or threats or impacts you guys want to talk about? Mike.
Yeah, I just feel like we have to add a little bit more to the climate in terms of weather that causes issues. And you've got increased ice storms. I think you should say increased ice and heavy wet snowstorms there. And then you can leave all the things underneath that the same. For instance, what we're dealing with today, they've really become almost identical in their damage. And then one thing that I think we deal with more than any ice or any heavy wet snow is gradient wind and high wind events. You know, a home in Middlebury had their garage destroyed and their car destroyed 2 weeks ago today. And that was strictly from wind. And that can be either in a tornado or a gradient wind event, but we're averaging about 2 a month right now that affect Vermonters all the time. So.
Great.
Thanks.
Chad, yep, you're had your hand up.
Great. Yeah, Mike, I'm glad you brought that up. I was thinking about sort of the increased presence of what we've been hearing about with microbursts. You're just seeing more and more of that. So I think that's good to add. One other thing, and I don't know, Patrick, if I can't see the entire table here, but do we have anything that speaks to, you know, just increased unpredictable weather? And that, you know, we're experiencing essentially a drought right now, I'd say, for what's going on today. But I know that the future is also projected to be one that there could be more intense wet weather. So it's just one or the other, it seems like. And given the fact that this is the rural resilience, I think a lot of our, you know, agricultural, you know, forestry, you think of like the burgeoning hemp industry, there's a lot of working landscape considerations. And I'm not sure if we have any of that contemplated here, just impacts to our agricultural working landscape.
And I don't know, Chad, whether to call that greater weather variability. Give me a name. Like greater weather variability may not be it. Maybe there's a better name, but you're like higher highs and lower lows potentially.
The
right?
Northeast has had a 74% increase in extreme precipitation events, for instance, since 1990, I believe.
Right.
So in other words, to Chad's point, there's no more of a kind of median rain that keeps us out of drought. We don't get anything. And then today we're going to have over 2 inches of total precip in southern Vermont.
Yeah, I think
drought for a month.
Yeah, a couple of years ago, that Halloween storm, random, you know, in the driest time of the year, we got what, 6 inches of rain or something crazy.
Mm-hmm.
And Chad, one thing I tried to capture earlier, but I think what you did is better. I did describe kind of like what I'm calling seasonal transition shifts, which isn't quite the same thing, but it's like you have warmer weather earlier than a hard frost too late and you kill buds and things like that. So I'll fold that together. I think it's a good one. Ben, over to you.
Thank you. Two things. Number one, on this list, I'm not sure if I see fires, but this is another big scary thing is that, you know, historically over the millennia, Vermont's forest does burn every 500 years or so. And we've got a pretty big fuel load right now, and we are having bigger droughts. And fire is a growing concern. Thing number two, I want to say something that I think Mike Burke would want to say, but I'm not sure he would. But in the constraints, also under the FEMA rules and specifically related to the resilience of our electrical grid, we have a benefit for those communities that are served by a municipal or nonprofit electrical co-op, because those are eligible applicants for FEMA public assistance. And after every ice storm, Vermont Electric Co-op and Washington Electric Co-op get 75% federal money to improve the resilience of their grids against future ice storms. And we've made good use of that money. Because the majority of Vermonters are served by Green Mountain Power, which is a private utility, they are not eligible for that source of federal resilience funds. And so there's actually an inequitable treatment built into federal law between private and public utility customers. And we don't have a state or federal mechanism to help with the resilience of our private electric customers, except as ratepayers and stockholders.
Yeah, I think you could context that in equitable access to FEMA funding, something like that.
Gotcha.
But Ben nailed it. We are not eligible for that.
Thanks, Ben. Other comments about, again, threats? Yeah, Catherine.
I'll just note, as it relates to Ben's comment about fires, is that we don't have a similar capacity for wildland firefighting that other states who experience long-term drought do, because they've historically understood the impacts of that. Our wildland firefighting capacity is centered around whatever capacity is at the local level, supplemented by DEC, or sorry, Forest and Parks, foresters, and wildland folks. So, but there's not that many of them, and they don't have, it's not like they have, it's not like we have like aerial lift capabilities where we can drop water on a fire or a retardant on a fire. So it's just something to point out in terms of barriers.
Right, there the next point. Other comments or issues people want to raise here?
Yeah, in response to what Erica just noted, if you haven't seen it yet, you should Google the video and try to find the video of the Quebec planes scooping water out of Lake Carmi. It's actually pretty cool when they were trying to fight a forest fire. But that's an aside. In terms of our focus on climate and greenhouse gas emissions, what strikes me about many of these, both the threats and the barriers, is that many of them will result in an increased demand on fossil fuel and potential increased greenhouse gas emissions. So you look at the hotter summers, Vermont's lack of air conditioning, more and more people are getting air conditioning. And how do those sorts of impacts relate to our greenhouse gas emissions is something that I would like to consider with these threats and barriers as well.
That's right. So either you have to have a bigger sort of resilient renewable power grid, or you're just going to pull in on more fossil fuels. And that cuts across a number of these for sure. Other thoughts or comments on this now, and then we'll talk just a little bit about what you want to do with this in terms of there is a next step around inventorying this and then begin to prioritize. So this is just a first step. But any other quick comments? We know we need to tie back to the legislation, as Joe said. Certainly we can clean this up from the bit of a mess it is now in real time, and then certainly share it with people. How do we kind of take it from here, co-chairs? I don't know if you want to think about that, or the committee as a subcommittee as a whole. Kind of how do we take this to begin to build one of our first objectives, which is kind of teasing this out?
So I think one of the tasks in I can't remember if it was objective 1 or objective 2 has us identifying threats and hazards and assessing them and ranking them, I think, and that's something that Marianne Woles is here to help us with. I think we can utilize this as a supplement to some of the other products that Vermont Emergency Management has in terms of the State Hazard Mitigation Plan and the State Emergency Management Plan to assess those hazards. But this is really what the purpose of this conversation was today, was to get our juices flowing and remind us of why we're here and what the threats and hazards of climate change are to Vermont rural communities.
Any questions about that or kind of next steps from this? And maybe we can kind of hand this over to Marion.
I'll just make a comment that I think, because we're going to be starting work on the inventory next week. And I think this sort of information is really important, because I think a big question is, given all of the activities, resilience and adaptation activities that are going on now, which threats are being addressed by those, and then which threats are not being addressed. And we sort of just did that by, brainstorming right here, but I think it's a little bit more rigorous isn't the right word, but systematic way of looking at it. It's like, here's everything that we're doing, here are the threats, what are we missing? And what are we not doing adequately enough? So I think I'm really glad you did this today, just to kind of ground us on what our mission is. So this is really helpful.
Terrific. Any other kind of quick comments on this? Thanks much, Joe, for the moment.
I think as we go forward, it would be really interesting, even though it's not exactly in our statutory charge, to add another column for opportunities. With all of these threats, there are barriers, there are negative impacts, but there's also opportunities as well, to not only negate some of the negative impacts, but also ensure that benefits are provided to rural communities and to perhaps address some of the more historical inequities.
Nice point. All right. Co-chairs, with that, I will save this document, stop sharing, and turn it back to you all.
Catherine, should we talk about how we want to plan future agendas?
Yes, I think we should. So first, we did talk about the meeting next week. And I'm just curious if there's we were curious if there's anyone besides me who's planning on being off next week because of school vacation. If you want to raise your hand and just let us know.
We all live at work, so.
I'm hoping to be,
vacation?
but we'll see.
So you, Mike, will be absent, you think? Okay. All right, so not a huge number. Okay. So that's good. That's encouraging. So one of the things that Pat and Erica and I talked about is just planning out a couple of meetings in advance. And one of the things that we definitely want to have is one meeting where we look at our scope of work and our objectives and what we're trying to accomplish, and have a really specific and intentional conversation about justice and equity in our work, recognizing that we will be considering it always as part of our work, but we thought it was an important enough issue to really set aside some agenda time to really specifically focus on that as the agenda item, and making sure that we're thinking of everything we need to be thinking of in our scope of work. So that's something that we're hoping to plan for a future meeting. And what was the other thing?
Catherine, I remember that was our primary one, was to figure out, we did have some equity concerns raised last meeting. So the thought was, let's have a really explicit and clear conversation early, so that can always be in people's mind as you sort through any number of these things. And I think in some ways, Graham nicely noted some kind of traditional inequities in rural Vermont in particular, and then there may be even in additional vulnerable populations that may be even further affected within that kind of broader inequitable challenge or problem. So I don't know if people have thoughts about whether you want a guest speaker, you want to invite the Just Transitions group to participate in that conversation, how you want to handle that. So, not only what this group knows, but what this group doesn't know potentially kind of gets surfaced, right? Because sometimes inequities get covered up because we just don't have people at the table to even be able to express them. So we miss them unintentionally. So what are people's thoughts about to have that conversation as rich as possible?
I think it'll be a good conversation to have. One thing I would like it to include, though, is some practical steps or recommendations that we can take to incorporate equity in what we're doing. Because I think a lot of the conversation has been identifying it as an issue, but I haven't heard yet, here are some specific things that you should be doing to address what those concerns are. So I mean, like practical, like what do we have to do kind of stuff.
Yeah, I like that. To Joe's point, we have it as a criteria of where to go after to help improve things, but not with what we do on it.
And it may be that I know that last time there was mention, that we'll go to Ben, that there was a various number of tools that already exist. EJ's, EPA's EJ screen. I think the states may be developing a similar kind of thing. So it may be like looking at how, one is what do we mean by inequity and how does it cut across a number of ways? So some definitional piece you could talk together about, as well as what we already know about the state, right? Might be useful for a bit of background. And then, okay, what are they? And then to Joe's point and Mike's, like, okay, what can we then do? Ben.
Well, yeah, so when we run the numbers in hazard assessment, we always come up with flooding as number one. And when you overlay flood vulnerability and social equity considerations, what always pops up is that more people get flooded who live in mobile homes than people who don't. And I mean, we have, at some point, I think we should bring in the people who really understand the housing stock, and particularly the mobile home situation, because where people live and how flood vulnerable and how well insulated their homes are is, I think, the big social equity overlay. And I guess the third one is people who live in apartments and don't own their homes.
Yeah, so tenants versus owners, and then again, mobile homes versus more permanent
Yeah.
structures. And Ben, because you already do that to some extent. Is that, for if this group wants it, is it possible for you all to present on some of what you already know about overlaying these vulnerabilities?
I don't think it's one place where I don't feel like we've really connected all the dots among the different state agencies. I feel like there's an unmet need in this area.
And it could be that as part of this agenda conversation, that these are issues that we identify that are unmet needs that we need to make sure we really delve into when we look at things like the vulnerability tool and the assessment tool, to make sure we take into account these sorts of inequities that exist. And because we're not intending this to be a one meeting conversation and then we've solved everything, it doesn't need to provide everything we need. It can set the stage for future conversations and identification of future needs.
Right.
And in terms of your request, Joe, about specific things, I'm thinking, for example, with this analysis tool that you're working on, that there was a suggestion about adding a part of that analysis as, does it have inequities and what are those? So practical solutions like that you're looking for.
Yeah.
Okay.
What should we really be doing? And
Yeah.
and understanding that we probably can't do everything that's perfect. I think what Anna said at the last meeting about how the data that are used really kind of miss the point of what some of the real issues are that certain marginalized communities are feeling, right? And so I don't know, this is just a really tough issue right now and trying to figure out how to approach it. So we need to do the best that we can, but still try to come up with something we can move forward on.
Stephanie, then Abby.
So just following up quickly on what Ben was saying for mobile home parks, I think Kelly Hamshaw at UVM would be the person we wanted to invite if we were going to have an overview on that. We just applied yesterday, actually, for a planning application to work with her at UVM and with DEC Rivers Program to do that analysis, to better understand flood risk of mobile home parks and get some better mapping and come up with some potential solutions or a toolkit of solutions that we could take to communities. And so that work won't be done in time for the climate action plan, but I think she's been thinking about it already and for a long time. So she'd be a good person to talk to.
Stephanie, what's her last name one more time?
Hamshaw.
Okay, great. Thank you. Just
Yeah.
great. Abby?
Hi, everybody. I guess I'm just struck. I apologize. This is the first time I've been able to listen in. I'm struck by the fact that a lot of the way that this has been framed so far seems kind of broadly theoretical. And I think that some of what is missing is the grounding in the real stories from people who are already living these lives. I mean, the thing that is very clear to me as a rural Vermonter is the fact that these inequities already exist, and these factors of life are already in existence now. And so just focusing on hazard mitigation, for example, or the ways that we can combat that, don't take into consideration the fact that people are already living in these circumstances and are already affected by the inequities on the ground. And so whatever you're putting into place is going to need to have taken that reality that they're living in and move it forward. So I guess any way that you can, bring in the voices of rural Vermonters to this conversation to sort of ground the theory in practice and in day-to-day life, I think will help increase the ultimate effectiveness of the work moving forward. Thank you.
Abby, I think just so folks know who you are, because you're an important co-chair. I just want to say who.
Oh, sorry, Abby Course. I'm the co-chair of Agriculture and Ecosystems Subcommittee and a member of the Climate Council representing Farm and Forest.
Excellent, great, thanks for joining us. Awesome. So, one possibility, and really up to you all, is that you start the conversation with as best you can, and then to Abby's point, there may need to be an outreach component where you do exactly as Abby described, is try to find a way to get some of those voices on the ground speaking to you about their lived experience, and that might be very informative for how you think about some of your ultimate recommendations. Other quick comments on this. I think people identified some specific needs like mobile homes, some particular expertise. We've got some screening tools, but there are things we may not know that we need to bring other voices to the table. Other thoughts on our equity conversation to be had that people want to just kind of inform, and again, want to be practical and outcome oriented. Other quick thoughts on this one?
Well, I think it's going to be important for us to coordinate with the Just Transitions Committee to see how they would like to be involved in this conversation with us.
Right. Good point. Good point. All right. Any other quick final thoughts before I turn it back to Erica and Catherine?
Yeah, I just have a quick question for folks on the subject of agenda development for the future. For folks that are identified as leads in the objectives and strategies in the work plan, are there areas of interest or conversations that you want to bring to the subcommittee, or bring some folks to the subcommittee to have a conversation that will help you noodle through some of your task? And if you don't have an answer for that right now, that's fine, but just think about that in terms of agenda development, because this is as much your meeting as anybody else's. And we are here to do this work together. So as you start moving forward on work that you are the lead on, anytime you need to bring a conversation to this group, speak up and we'll get it. We'll make sure it gets on the agenda, as well as any other guest speakers that we need to bring in.
And to add to this, the good words Erica said is that part of the goal of the work plan with milestones is so you can start to figure out what you need to talk about at what subcommittee meeting, right? Graham, I think you had a comment.
Yeah, I was just following up on what y'all were just saying. I was wondering if there's some folks who might be able to help, might be organizations like the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board, Vermont Council on Rural Development, organizations whose missions and visions relate directly to equity and representing people living in rural situations, people who are working on farmland access and stewardship. Folks like that could help to, I think, direct you to people to bring in who can speak directly from those communities about what their needs are on the ground and how they see them being affected by climate change over time, the kind of support they could use from a committee that's devoted to resilience and adaptation in rural communities. So just some thoughts.
And Graham, would you mind if you can think of those organizations like, specifically come to mind, if you want to just put those in chat real quickly, that's helpful for the notes just to have very concrete listening. So then people know who to reach out to. So if you don't mind doing that, that'd be great.
And then finally, before we move off that, I was looking online to see if their recording of the training that the Just Transitions Committee did was on the Climate Council page, and it wasn't there, even though I remember it was recorded. So I'm wondering if that's going to be available, because that had a lot of connection to resilience and adaptation. And so for folks who either didn't get a chance to see it or may want to watch it again, it would be great if that was going to be available.
That will be. We just haven't
great.
gotten it back from the presenters yet.
Wonderful. Great. That's good news.
All right. So a lot of good ideas about how to carry on that conversation in the next, when the co-chair is going to get that scheduled, again, to really focus very much on equity and get to know thinking through it. Okay. Eric and Catherine, back to you guys, I think.
So next on our agenda is public comment. So we'll open the floor to public comment for folks who haven't gotten a chance to comment on the items we were just talking about or any other items. Feel free to just jump in if you can't raise your hand. Dale, did I see you unmuted yourself?
Yes, thank you, Catherine. This is Dale Azaria with CLF. I just wanted to add one item perhaps for you to consider for the chart of hazards and threats. There was a little bit of talk about the increased risk of short-term drought, and I think it's important to consider how that impacts access to drinking water, especially for rural residents, as well as impact on working lands and on natural ecosystems. So the talk that I heard was mostly about risk of forest fire, but I think there are other risks associated with that too.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that comment, Dale. I think that's right on point.
And thank you all so much for the work you're doing.
Thanks for being here.
And if people have ideas for the chart, I'm going to just type them in as you talk. So I've already added that. So thank you, Dale. That's great.
And Laura, thanks for joining us today. Hi.
Good morning or afternoon. Jeez, I'm kind of turned upside down here. Thanks for your work, everyone. This is my first time tuning in, and it was late, so happy to see how many folks are here. A thought that I have had, and actually was going to write to you about, but here you are. We have in the legislature the Rural Economic Development Working Group. So that's a number of legislators across parties who meet. And I think it's both a good place to kind of check rural issues and also to push out information. One of the things, of course, that I'm quite concerned about with rural Vermont is making sure that we have buy-in and that we're communicating. And so I would love to help facilitate. I don't know what the most effective way is. I'm not sure if we have a lot of volunteers here or a lot of paid folks here. If it's to bring you guys to our meeting, to add us to your distribution list. I think it would be good though to make that connection and have it kind of be regular. So that's all.
Thanks so much for that. I appreciate that you're here and offered that connection. I had actually made that note long ago in terms of our stakeholder outreach to make sure we connected with that caucus. So I'm really glad that you're here. And I think depending upon the agenda item, we're open to both. Erica and I or other members could come and meet with the caucus, and we'd love to hear, a conversation with the caucus. Also, if there's specific agenda items where we'd love to invite folks specifically, and we can add you to the distribution list. So yes to all.
Great. And we meet Thursdays at 8 a.m. The session is starting to wind down, but I think it would be wonderful if we were able to at least make that connection. If you and Erica are able to do that this coming Thursday or the following Thursday, I'll have to check in with Rep. Kimball. I don't think we have anything on the agenda for this coming Thursday. That would be fantastic. And I think adding that group to your distribution list. The other thing we do is a public hearing with Rural Vermont, usually in the fall.
Oh,
I don't know if there's some tie-in or way, but just things to think about.
Thanks so much.
Great, thank you.
Are there other comments or questions or suggestions? Great. Are there any committee members that have any things that they want to share before we adjourn?
Co-chairs, one question. I think someone had to jump off at two, noting the kind of hour and a half versus hour meeting frame. So is your intent to ask people to save an hour each Friday or an hour and a half each Friday?
Yeah, I wanted to pose that question to folks, whether we want to stick with an hour and a half meeting time frame. And if we end early, we end early, but that way we can at least make the time, have the time on people's calendars set.
I see Ann and Mike nodding their heads yes. I'll tell you, and Joe's giving a thumbs up. From a facilitator perspective, it felt much less rushed. Whereas previous meetings, I felt like I had to cut people off, and I hate that feeling. So having the space to do an hour and a half is great.
Okay. Here. We'll keep it hour and a half. Okay.
Well, if
thank you
there's
for-
nothing else, yeah.
Really good discussion today. Thank you very much, Pat, for facilitating our discussion today, and we really appreciate everybody's input. It was very good.
And Mike, the snow has been coming down for the last hour in Fairfax, so I don't know.
I know it's gotten much harder.
Yeah. So hopefully the rest of your day stays calm.
Yes, we're down to 428 Vermonters that don't have power. So
That's
we're
good.
almost there.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day and great weekend.
Thank you.
Yeah, bye.